This conference will now be recorded.
Isn't that nice how she says that? Okay, so really, this is a special edition. We've done this once before, where the Learning Working Group prepares a special learning session for us. And so Sia and Matt are the co-chairs of that working group, and I'm going to introduce to Sia, who will introduce the session.
Great, thank you, John. Welcome everyone to the second session of the Learning Working Group of the Movement for Community-Led Development. Matt and I are very excited about this session. The objective of the session really feeds into the mission of the Learning Working Group, which is to create opportunities and foster learning within and across the movement. So the objective of the session is to build a culture of sharing and learning from failure, as well as introduce a tool that can be used and also demonstrate how that tool can be used to facilitate learning. We have a great lineup of speakers today, of resource persons. You've heard their names. Manisha Gupte from Pune, India, has been part of the women's rights movement in India since the mid-1970s. She has a multidisciplinary background in microbiology and sociology, and she's a co-founder and co-convener of MASUM, which is a rural women's organization. In the interest of full disclosure, she is also an advisor and partner of the 3D program for girls and women. David Yamran is the design and M&E coordinator for the Search for Common Ground's DC-based institutional learning team, and his current work includes researching and developing guidance for successful international NGO to local NGO transitions, and you'll hear more about that in his presentation. And finally, Brett Weisel is the Associate Director of Capacity Building and Training at the Global Health Advocacy Incubator here in Washington, D.C., and he's responsible for developing and implementing capacity building strategies and evaluation models for civil society organizations all around the world. So welcome to everyone, and especially these three speakers. Thank you for agreeing to share your failures and what you've learned from them. We're very grateful to you. It's not always an easy thing to do. But before we hear from them, Matt and I would like to basically set everyone up for failure.
So just tell me when to click.
Okay, thank you. So, as I said, the Learning Working Group was established to really foster learning within and across the movement. And usually in development, when we think about learning, we tend to focus on success stories and what works models. But today, Matt and I wanted to switch things up and move beyond the fear of failure to actually the process of learning from failure. So next slide, John, please. So we work in a field that really has a winning imperative. You know, many of us are within organizations that are mission-driven. We want to succeed, we want to excel, we constantly have to show results, we want to make a difference. We are also accountable to various stakeholders, so to the communities that we serve, to governments, to other NGOs, partners, donors in particular, and we are also beholden to our own egos. So failure brings a lot of fear, shame, risks, and it has some real costs as well. There's no getting away from that. Next slide. But failure is actually a reality of life, and it's a reality of the work that we do, which is often includes many different moving parts, different partners, things that we can't control. And if we can move beyond the fear of failure, there's actually a lot to gain. Things like curiosity and wisdom and opportunity to take risks and come up with innovations, and also ultimately greater accountability. Next slide, please. So we are not only a success-driven field, we're also an evidence-driven field. So there is plenty of evidence out there. I'm not going to go into specifics, but there is plenty of evidence that you can go from failure to success. There are lots of celebrity stories, but also I think if we think about our own lives and our own work, we will find moments in our lives where we have gone from failure to success, sometimes consciously and sometimes just by bumbling through. Next slide. So what are the steps to developing a culture of learning from failure? There are three main steps. One is to embrace failure. So put your ego aside, admit it, be open about it, be deliberate about it, and talk about it. Get it out there. Sometimes when that happens, it stops being your own personal or institutional failure, and putting it out there into the public realm can make it basically fodder for joint learning. Next thing to do is to figure out what went wrong and what you learned from it. And from there, build some competencies. Grappling with failure can give you the opportunity to practice skills, to ask really important questions about the assumptions you had going in, about assumptions that you're making as you move forward. And it also forces you into some humility and listening to others, which is another important way to learn. And the final step is actually building an organizational culture where you build learning from failure into your work. So there's conscious and systematic examination, discussion, documentation, and sharing of lessons learned. It also sort of allows us all to say, we didn't know what we were doing, what could we do differently, and to test out some new ideas and take some risks. But the point is not to sit around and sort of bask in your failure. If you're honest about failure and being systematic about learning from it, then you can become more accountable, because the idea is not to repeat those same mistakes, not to make the same assumptions, not to use the same processes for planning and for implementation. So ultimately, as I said, it can lead to greater accountability and to some innovations and ultimately success. Next slide, please. So what's next? Here within the movement, we have great opportunities to learn from each other. We're all bringing, diverse ways of working, diverse stakeholders, diverse histories and lessons learned. So there is an opportunity to share information and learn from each other. Practice, practice, practice is the best thing. If you integrate learning from failure into your normal routine of work, it will lead to more success. And then, of course, something that the Learning Working Group has wanted to do, is sort of a continuing thing, is sharing resources and tools. So with that, I'll hand over to Matt, and he'll take us through one of the tools. Thanks.
Thank you. Matt?
Great. Thank you, Sia. Welcome, everybody. So my name is Matt Lineal, and I'm Impact and Analytics Director at NUR International. I wanted to briefly set up our three speakers on our panel today in sharing a specific format and template and an experience from NUR International. So at NUR, we really firmly believe and value learning from failure. And over the past 6 years, we've developed a process and templates and formats to work this into our daily and annual mode of operating. And so every year, and we're just about to get this started, in the fourth quarter of the year, we actually have staff go through, and any staff who wish to contribute can write up a short one-page document on a failure and a lesson learned from that year. Then at our annual business meeting in January, all those lessons learned are required reading. We come together and we discuss those lessons learned, especially those ones that are the highest priority and more generalizable to the rest of the organization. And then we take action on it. as relevant, whether that's the new year. And some of these lessons learned go through multiple rounds. It takes years to really address and get to the core root of the challenge. Others are quick fixes. And so what I'm sharing today briefly is a blank template, and endorsing this as a tool and asking our panelists today to use this tool, we're hoping that to show how just having a common language and framework can help share learning even across very complex subject matter and subject matter that can seem very content specific. When you have a standard tool and you have a simple way to describe things, you can do so in a pretty brief format that can be understandable and create generalizable knowledge as well. Next slide. So in the template, what you'll see here and what you'll hear each speaker present on is a general lesson learned. And we start out by just summarizing in a brief title. What are we talking about? Next slide. From there, we start with the assumption. And by isolating the assumption from any sort of failure or lesson learned, we can avoid conflating what is really the core issue at play from any particular individual, from any particular action, or any follow-up or lesson learned. So we can really isolate what was that assumption that we made. And oftentimes what you'll find is that the assumptions that we make are very understandable and logical and seem very reasonable. And then it's only when you get to the failure that you can understand then where things actually went wrong. So building off the assumption, then we go to the failure. And oftentimes this is, in this framework, treated as a symptom of that core problem, which is often a faulty assumption. And so in very plain terms, let's talk about and describe what went wrong and try to get at that in somewhat objectively. From there, then, we can generate the lessons learned. So what did you actually learn from that? How was that original assumption incorrect or flawed? And again, going back and looking at the symptoms and getting back to the root cause of where did we go wrong in this process, and really go back and drill down into the issue. You're going to see all the panelists do that in application here. And then finally, the last step is, how did you apply what you learned? And this is the step where, we as individuals, as organizations or departments or wherever you're applying this, can then describe, okay, this is actually what we did to fix it. And so by separating it out, the lessons learned and learning from failure into these 4 steps: assumptions, failure, what you learned, and how you applied it, you can concretely make sure you're not jumping to conclusions and you're building in a logical fashion, describing exactly what happened in any given circumstances. So we're going to have chances to go ahead and see this tool in action, and our first speaker is Manisha Gupte. So I will invite her to join us and unmute herself and present her.
Yeah, she's unmuted and raring to go.
Hello, everybody. So,
hi.
So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you the story about how we learned from a failure within the rural women's organization that my partner, this is my married partner, Ramesh Awasthi, and I started in 1987. So the title, as you can see, is From Community Participation to Community Leadership and Ownership of a Rural Women's Organization in Western India, the case study of Masoom in Maharashtra. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, so one of the assumptions that we had was that urban, educated and sensitive professionals can coordinate a rural organization that encourages community participation and leadership to manage work at the local level. So I'll talk about that assumption and why that assumption came, how it came in spite of us being cognizant of the fact that we always expected the community to take over Masoom, which is an acronym for Mahila Sarvangeen Utkarsh Mandal, loosely translated into English as Women's Forum for Integrated Development. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, so first, before this, let me tell you the story of Masoom. Uh, Ramesh and I lived in a small village, very much at the back of nowhere for 5 years when we started Masoom. And Masoom, in fact, was started because both of us had a social activist background. We weren't part of any political party, but we were part of social movements, the movement, the Dalit rights movement, minority movements, civil liberties movements when we were in Bombay. And then we shifted to live in this small village. And right from the beginning, we knew that the work really didn't belong to us, the work belonged to the community, and that the community was the owner, but that the owner did not know its entitlement and access and opportunity to what they were entitled to. And so, therefore, when we formed Masoom, most of our staff, 90% of our staff, was actually rural. Most 90% of Masoom staff are women. And not only that, but the women are also from some intersection of vulnerability. So, in terms of marital status, in terms of, say, physical ability, in terms of caste, in terms of class, in terms of any position in the village. And so, therefore, most of our staff were rural women. Now, what happened was that after we left the village, which also one of the reasons of wanting it to become community owned, because if we stayed there, then our Dalit and our marginalized leadership would not have got credibility within the village. And that's one of the reasons we didn't stay in the village forever. And what happened was, because as urban educated professionals, were satisfied with just one thing that we do. I mean, nobody is satisfied with one single thing. And so Masoom, which we had hoped would be or had expected to be just a small community-based organization, actually grew and grew to a state and national and also to some levels to a South Asian level. But that therefore necessitated the formation of an urban office. And we got some really lovely colleagues in the urban office, but the ratio was still 9 rural colleagues to maybe one urban person. Now, here I want to talk about certain learned behaviors, certain things that just propel us to do something because those are the things, those are within our comfort zone. So we felt that urban educated people like us would still be able to manage a rural organization. So here now then I start that once we started this process over the next few years, we realized first the inherent inequality between the urban and rural staff in terms of education, technological skills, exposure to English, computers, contemporary debates and discourses, both national and international, as well as acceptance by government officials and even to the local community to some extent. Having somebody come from Pune, having somebody come from Bombay, had more credibility in the village. Now, these started becoming clear, and that started creating discomfort within us. We realized that the vision of Masoom in transferring ownership of the work to the rural community was being actually adversely impacted through this process that we had put in place in spite of committed urban staff. Now, what happened was that the urban educated people possessed the formal skills in varying measures, but they didn't have an understanding of the lived realities of rural community. So what happened was that they knew the theory, but they didn't know the practice. So the praxis was missing. On the other hand, our rural colleagues not only had negotiated uh, power relations based on gender, caste, and poverty at the individual and group level through the village meetings, through asking questions to elected representatives about budget allocations for women and children. They'd done a lot in spite of facing backlash, but they had not necessarily learned the skills beyond the job. So whether they were paralegal workers, whether they were identifying cervical cancer at the village level, all these things were learned only on the job. And they didn't have very much beyond that to run an organization. Therefore, then what happened was that they were they were cognizant of the social and cultural reality, and individual urban professionals were actually the inadequate ones. That's what we started realizing. It was very painful for us. It was painful for the urban staff. It was painful for the rural staff. But the collective and rural group that formed 90% of the staff actually had the skills to run the organization. Now, some urban individuals in whom we invested left midway, not for this reason, but because they had better jobs, because they went to do their PhD abroad. Or some that stayed back, some of the people that stayed back assumed that the leadership transition would be of a vertical and hierarchical nature. So what happened was that the rural team went along with this assumption, even if they were very uneasy about it. They were sometimes baffled with the changes when people came in and people left. And when the due process of participatory decision making was not perceived to be inadequate, or it was sometimes even seen as whimsical. May I have the next slide, please?
Yes. Oops.
So what we learned was that while our vision was of transferring Masoom to the rural community, what we were actually doing was we were trusting our rural staff to run the programs, and in spite of they being marginalized and were able to handle backlash at the village level, but we were concentrating on an urban group to develop the skills of fundraising, monitoring and evaluation, and representing the organization at the state and national level, and dealing with government functionaries at the district and state levels. Now, this was creating a schism, this was creating further inequality. So we were doing exactly the opposite of what we were doing in the community, trying to break inequality by having a poor woman identify, either uterine prolapse or listening to domestic violence from a rich woman. And while we were trying to deal with inequality at the community level, we were actually creating inequality within the organization. We also realized and learned that local people with enhanced capacity to lead programs in terms of content, skills, knowledge can collectively sustain an organization, along with the participation from enlightened and committed outsiders. Now, outsiders.
Manisha,
Yes.
just want to give you the 2-minute warning.
Okay, thank you, Sia.
Yeah.
So while outsiders can be committed to the social process, when they leave and go to other cities or to other countries. But even if the rural staff leaves, they are in the same geographical area. And because they're in the same geographical area, most of the rural staff that have left, in spite of Masoom having a very low lose out rate, still participate even today as volunteers within Masoom's programs. And then therefore our trust in local people who have the highest stakes in the functioning and sustainability of the organization came back to us only because of the failure. If it hadn't been this failure, we might have just gone ahead with a plan of handing the organization over to urban people. So now my last slide, please. May I have the last slide? How did we apply what we learned? We strengthened the exposure of our rural staff to state, national, and South Asia level meetings. We saw that they had skills of training. So, like if they train medical officers at the district level, then obviously their community respected them much more. We realized that handing over the organization to the local community was easier from the rural staff rather than from the urban staff. And so now our community realizes that they are actually entitled, they are owners of Masoom in many ways, and they are the owners of the government health services, of asking questions at the village level, looking at law enforcement. And so therefore we increase their credibility at the village level. A strong team consisting of urban and rural staff was put in place after this kind of substantive equality, when we had brought everybody at the same level of access and opportunity and result. And largely effective management of the organization with these combined skills helped us to consolidate the strengths of the rural and urban staff, and then therefore instead of being opposed to each other in some ways, they became a strong collective team. And I think that that's where Masoom is. It's not easy. It's a work in progress. I'm sure we're going to make many more mistakes now, but mistakes, I think, are important. And I think that's the only way to go, because social transformation is much more important than target-based successes at an immediate level. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manisha.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Manisha, and that's a wonderful insight that you concluded with, that social transformation being more important than target-based successes. Our next speaker, and we can move to the next slide, John, will be David Yamron. And at the conclusion of the three presentations here, we're going to have a little time for Q&A and discussion. So please write down and hold your questions. So David will now share a lesson learned. We heard from Manisha regarding relationships between urban and rural staff when in this case study from India. Now we're going to hear relationships between international based efforts and what we might call a local project effort. Again, different content matter, different level of issue, and David will share some of his lessons learned.
Thanks so much, Matt. And yeah, thank you for setting it up like that. I think there are some interesting synergies between the previous presentation and this one about sort of the difficulties and assumptions involved in working across dividing lines. So to start off, I'm David Yamron. I'm the Design Monitoring and Evaluation Coordinator on the Institutional Learning Team at Search for Common Ground here in DC. For those not familiar with Search, we were founded in 1982. We're the world's largest dedicated peace-building organization with about 800 staff members across, I think, 36 countries, although that number keeps changing. And our mission, broadly speaking, is to transform the way the world deals with conflict, away from adversarial approaches and towards cooperative solutions. And today, I'm not going to be talking about peace building per se, but I'll be talking about learning from failure in the context of a specific tool, the developmental evaluation methodology. So I think I've found, and maybe this resonates, that a significant barrier to closing the loop and actually learning from failure is actually providing the space, the time, and the resources to spend reflecting and adapting. It's so difficult to actually set aside that space. And one key advantage of developmental evaluation is that it provides exactly that. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with developmental evaluation, I can talk a little bit about what that is. Developmental evaluation, or DE, it's not a performance evaluation or an accountability measure. DE is an approach to continuous adaptation of interventions and programs through the use of evaluative thinking and feedback. So this involves having one or more, although typically one, external evaluator embedded within a program team, ideally on a full-time basis, although we've seen diversions from that. Working with program teams to contribute to modifications in program design, contributing to targeted outcomes identified by the funder, by the program team, throughout implementation. They use a variety of data collection methods and activities on an as-needed basis, and their role within the project team is to facilitate real-time evidence-based reflection and decision-making. So overall, they sort of change and adapt as the program changes. They deliver contextualized, emergent findings on an ongoing basis throughout the program cycle. So what happened in this case? Search for Common Ground led one of these developmental evaluations of a program implemented by a consortium of international and Cambodian organizations, which had the goal of increasing the number of children living in safe, nurturing, family-based care. This is FCF in Cambodia. The premise of this project was that this team could form a diverse, multi-stakeholder consortium using a collective impact framework and work together across these dividing lines successfully to implement this program to increase safe, nurturing, family-based care. And by entering the developmental evaluation, we sort of accepted this premise. And through this process of becoming embedded within the program team, gaining buy-in with stakeholders, this meant that we accepted where stakeholders were, that we'd look at the assumptions underpinning the project together and sort of move forward questioning those assumptions. One of the key unspoken assumptions, I think, in the project was that this really diverse, big consortium of international and local organizations could overcome biases and cultural distance to effectively work together across dividing lines. This was the assumption, but it wasn't necessarily aired. And this is one of the key roles of the DE that I'm going to talk about in the next couple minutes, is that it can help identify these unexamined assumptions, hidden biases, bring them to light, and identify adaptations and ways to move forward when there's an issue, which there was. So in this case, the consortium had real difficulty setting up a knowledge sharing system, sharing knowledge across teams and partners, stakeholders, and collaborating. So as part of the program team, internal but external, the developmental evaluator explored ways to address this failure. And the evaluation found that one way this knowledge sharing problem manifested was in difficulties collaborating, one specific way, difficulties collaborating with non-English speakers living outside of the capital, Phnom Penh. So this appeared in a variety of ways, and the DE team used a variety of data collection methods and reflection meetings, travel to local partners throughout the provinces to really understand what was happening. So I have a quote that sort of illustrates how some of the local partners felt about program implementation. They said, there's no translator during the management meetings. You have local NGOs that cannot address or raise anything. You only have foreigners leading the discussion. There's English or foreigner dominant at the moment. This is why so far local NGOs only listen and don't raise their own ideas or contribute. So I also want to note that it was heavily Phnom Penh based. So another representative of a local partner in the provinces said, it's heavily Phnom Penh based, but that's the skew. There's more NGOs based there. They say they represent the province side of things, but that's not always the case. Many organizations say they work in provinces, but they work in the provinces directly around Phnom Penh, which are very different. And so the sort of the result of this was that Cambodian partners felt alienated from the project. They felt like they didn't have a voice to contribute to program implementation. The DE noted that they would bring up things like, for example, that learning meetings were held in English, or management meetings as well. That project materials and deliverables produced by the program weren't available in Khmer. Regular learning meetings didn't prioritize participation from partners, as that quote illustrated, and that coordination meetings were held only in the capital, things like that. And as a result, implementation suffered. Stakeholders had few avenues to consult local partners about actually on-the-ground implementation, and from the other direction, local partners were unable to provide feedback and make adaptations that were necessary. So the project overall was seen as top-down, non-inclusive. So how we applied what we learned. The DE conducted these reflection and learning activities, and it recommended a number of changes to the project to address these issues. But I think the critical part of developmental evaluation that I want to focus on here is that DE is not about simply documenting outcomes and writing reports about them. It's a critical part of DE is about actually working with the team to create adaptations and modeling solutions to address the issues identified. So in this case, the DE was an active participant in the program team and modeled changes proactively through creating a learning summit. This was one of the ways it did. And in that learning summit, they selected a Khmer Master of Ceremonies to lead the event. They previously the translation screens that displayed what the speaker was saying were the English one was huge and the Khmer one was tiny. They flipped that around. So the Khmer one was big and the English was the DE suggested restructuring project feedback mechanisms, completely restructuring, in line with partner requests. being to be partner-driven, to emphasize knowledge sharing and collaborative learning, and to really bring together Cambodian organizations in group decision-making processes. This also meant integrating feedback mechanisms into the adaptations that were actually recommended by the DE. So that's part of it too, is building in reflection from the Learning Summit that were modeled to continuously feedback input into the DE. Overall, I think what I can say is that the DE provided an avenue for what was a formerly top-down project to make significant adaptations to prioritize Cambodian partners. DE is particularly suited to complex environments like FCF in Cambodia with huge, diverse multi-stakeholder consortiums with untested theories of change, with countrywide programs with a variety of different types of partners. I think it's important to know that everyone was aware of that there was an issue in FCF in coordination. Everyone was aware of the complexity, but the DE's role was to sift through that complexity and make specific, I think you might agree, often very simple changes that might seem obvious to outsiders. But these very simple changes had a huge outside impact. And it often takes that third-party perspective to sort of point to the unspoken assumptions and model those changes. So as I said at the beginning, a big part of the process of learning from failure is creating the space to be able to reflect on what went wrong, to build in time and energy to adapt. And that's one thing that the DE was able to do in this case. I think I'll conclude here with a final quote. So a local organization in Cambodia said this is sort of during implementation of the adaptations recommended by the DE. There's more of a national presence, and it's probably still not enough, but there are still lots of expats bringing Western ways, but in group meetings it's definitely happening. It felt more representative than usual in terms of speakers. Nationals are the ones that will make it a sustainable project. So this is a process of continuous adaptation. This program is ongoing, but in this case, DE was able to highlight Cambodian voices and I think really learn from failure and force the program to do so. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing, David. I think what's particularly striking about the case study that you share, and we can also observe from the example from Manisha as well, is that the assumptions are underpinned by very good intentions. I think we can all agree that launching a collective impact to hear out local partners is admirable, but then and we may even in our other work or other lives hold similar assumptions actually right now still. But then what's striking about your example is that there's many lessons, there's failures associated with that and the way that played out, and then there's lessons learned to apply as well. And so that really offers us a good pause for reflection on your example, but also then how can we generalize this knowledge to even our own work. So our next speaker, and we can go ahead, will be Brett Weisel, and we're going now to move to talk about policy work. Again, part of the sharing this template and framework is also seeing how we can share lessons learned on different subject content, but also see how this framework also adapts to provide a common dialogue about these different lessons. And so, without further ado.
Thanks, Matt. And first let me say, as a self-taught M&E nerd for advocacy, I appreciate the concept and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of turn a little bit inwardly and take a critical and analytical eye to the work that we do. And double kudos for keeping us to 5 slides. My colleagues know how much I value that. Yeah, as Matt said, I wanted to look at this idea from a policy change lens, because that's what my organization does. And just a little bit of context, the Global Health Advocacy Incubators is a program within the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. And we have basically taken the lessons learned and the advocacy models from decades of tobacco control work across the world and applied them to other public health policies. But our roots are in tobacco control, and even though I don't work a whole lot on our tobacco control work, I'm going to attempt to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned from there, because we certainly adapted those lessons to the incubator and the work that we do every day. So first, oops, sorry, I'm jumping the gun here. So, the assumption that we worked with in terms of our organizational model is basically, and I think this would resonate for anybody who does advocacy, is that policy change, we do policy change because it has the opportunity to yield population-wide outcomes. It's cost efficient for the most part, and it has huge impact if done well. And so passing the policy is that culmination of that advocacy process. And I think as advocates, it's so easy to get tunnel vision where you're focused on getting legislation from point A to point B. And then at long last, the president, whatever, the prime minister, parliament makes the legislation official public law. And then you celebrate and you have your victory. But the reality of the situation is that strong policies must be implemented effectively, or you're going to negate the policy win. In other words, if the policy isn't implemented by government in an efficient and effective way, those outcomes that you're searching for, those intended outcomes, are not going to happen. And we've been doing tobacco control work for a long time and have seen this play out in a variety of different ways, from our internal organizational perspective, from the perspective of government, and I mean, for me personally, I found this to be very much a lesson learned. And so thinking about what we learned, the first thing I would say is that policy implementation actually requires an independent advocacy campaign of its own. And it may look a little bit different than the advocacy campaign for passing a policy, but just like you need to build political support, and just like you need to build public support for the policy to get it over the finish line, you do the same thing for the implementation phase. It may be targeted, it may be very technical in some aspects, but you still need those strategies to build and maintain political and public support. We also learned that we needed a framework to crystallize our thinking. The head of our global program is very much into frameworks, and I've learned that I am myself as well, because they help to sort of simplify in a visually appealing way very complex processes. And so we learned that we needed to sort of think through what our approach was going to be as an organization to implementing policies. And we saw a number of examples where policies were not implemented effectively that really had negative long-term impact. An example is very early on, India passed a pretty comprehensive tobacco control legislation. And while my understanding of India is fairly limited, what I've learned is that it's a very complex political system and often seems to be fairly decentralized in terms of how policies are actually implemented. And that complex system created very significant difficulties for actually implementing the law that was passed. In Thailand, Thailand passed a strong tobacco control set of tobacco control policies, but prevalence never really declined. And for the most part, it was because the law wasn't really implemented and enforced. In Turkey, we saw Turkey's essentially focused. They passed, again, a set of strong tobacco control policies, but in terms of implementation of those policies, they essentially focused on Istanbul and ignored everywhere else. And what happened was, after initial prevalence declines, the prevalence started to go back up. And so you have these like lessons learned and in countries where we saw the fundamental breakdown of all these strong policies. And so we thought, we need to think internally as an organization how we're going to approach this and how we're going to provide support to the civil society organizations that we work with on the ground. And as a result, we recognized there was a real need to develop capacity, both for civil society, because implementation we learned in terms of policy implementation was not a lot of civil society organizations fully understood how complicated it was and what their role in that whole thing is. For the most part, policy implementation is the responsibility of the government, and as a result, civil society advocates that we have been working with to pass those policies or implement them effectively didn't quite know what their role was in all of this. And at the same time, there was a need to sort of talk to government a little bit about how and provide global examples and evidence as to how these policies can be implemented effectively. And one instance we were in, I was somewhat recently in Senegal, and we were doing an implementation workshop with civil society and government, and a number of government officials were kind of arguing about, and differences of opinion, I should say, about jurisdictional issues and whose role was this part, whose role was that part. And we had to take a moment to get everybody to look at the 5,000-foot level instead of looking at their own little fiefdoms and see how this whole thing was going to play out long term. The other thing that we learned is policy implementation works best when civil society and government forge a strong partnership at the very beginning. And we've seen this breakdown as well, where a somewhat recent example that a colleague was just sharing with me was we were, again, holding an implementation workshop. I believe it was Nigeria, and there was this perspective by somebody at senior level in the Ministry of Health that the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids was basically telling them what to do. And that's the last thing we want as an organization, mentioning sort of this top-down process. That's not how we operate. That's not how we want to operate. But there was this perception, a misperception, quite honestly. And so we had a workshop plan that we basically canceled because we needed to sort of reset those relationships and forge a stronger partnerships from the beginning. At the same time, advocates need to kind of weave in and out of this role of being partner with the government while also still maintaining their sort of advocate role. And there are times when they need to put their advocate hat back on and talk about, or if necessary, to create political or public pressure on government officials for perhaps drafting weak regulations, or there's a delay in the process. They got to put that advocate hat back on and potentially sort of build public support, work with government to strengthen those regulations, whatever the case may be. This is a very much internal learning for me, personal learning, but the fundamentals of implementation are fairly consistent across countries and even policies. And I was a little bit surprised by that when I first started working at the incubator. And the processes will vary greatly, but the basic fundamentals of what needs to happen to implement a policy is fairly similar across various countries and political systems. And finally, when you're looking at tobacco control policies, the tobacco industry is never going to give up, and every stage in the policy process is a new opportunity for the tobacco control to weaken legislation or regulations, to delay the process, to kill the process or kill the bill or whatever the case is. And so maybe that's not quite a lesson learned, but just reinforcing the
lesson continually learned.
Continual learning, exactly.
Lifelong learning.
So how do we apply that learning? As I said, we developed this implementation framework. I was not here when this was developed, but I use it all the time. Oh, I don't see it there. Anyway, maybe it'll come. But it's a simple framework that basically boils down the implementation process into a few simple concepts. You have to draft your regulations, draft strong regulations, and then put together a comprehensive implementation plan. And that plan is going to consist of educating the public about the new law, and sometimes that requires very specific communication strategies to affected populations. So, for example, in tobacco control, if you pass a smoke-free law, specific communications are needed for restaurants and bars and places like that, so that they know what they need to do to comply to the law. So, we developed this framework. Oh, I'm sorry. And then there's the education piece, and then there's obviously the enforcement of the law piece. where, the responsibility of government to enforce the law. And finally, there's an assessment and monitoring component to ensure that compliance is high, that enforcement is happening effectively and consistently. And so we sort of broke down this complex, convoluted process into very simple components. And it really helps both internally, staff better understanding how can we support civil society as well as government in implementing these laws, as well as providing capacity development opportunities for all the various stakeholders that we work with. We incorporated planning for policy implementation early on into campaign strategies as a result of some of the failures that we saw. And I have a colleague at the office, she's a lawyer, and she has a great perspective on this. And she basically says advocates need to draft laws with the implementation process in mind. So that there are so many opportunities for loopholes and so many opportunities for breakdowns. Advocates need to understand what those loopholes are and address them in actually the very beginning of the advocacy process of writing laws. And that's obviously relevant for government as well. And I was just recently in Tanzania, and we're working on a comprehensive road safety legislation there. And as soon as I got into the cab to go to the hotel, one of my first thoughts was, oh man, this is going to be difficult to implement. And we're not even close to actually passing the policy.
Was there a seatbelt?
Thankfully, there was a seatbelt.
Okay.
But it just goes to show how this concept has permeated throughout the culture of the organization, and we're thinking about it from day one, right? Instead of when we actually pass the legislation or pass policy. Next, this is again ongoing, but we continue to expand our work combating industry interference. And again, this goes without saying, and it's something that our organization has always done. But again, just so many examples of so many of our opportunities where the industry got in there and was at the negotiating table writing regulation or writing legislation or using influence and power and money to delay the legislative process and delay the implementation process. And so, we continue to sort of invest in this strategy to isolate the industry and to counter the work that they do. As I mentioned, the head of our global work loves frameworks, and I do as well. And so what we did, and what we kind of realized was not only just passing the policy is not the end of the policy process. Implementation isn't the end of the policy process because there's still another step, and we call that step. We've been calling that step the policy institutionalization. And essentially what that means is there's this, advocates and government can implement very specific strategies that institutionalize that law within government. And what we're looking for is fundamentally changing the norms within government and the structures and the processes within government so that that policy is institutionalized within the very fabric of the government. A recent example I was just thinking of was the 9/11 compensation fund, where advocates kept going back every few years advocating for funding for this fund, right? And just recently they passed legislation that I think it funds it until 2092 or something like that. So essentially what we're talking about is it's institutionalized now, and they don't have to go year after year advocating for funding. Oh, there's my framework. There it is. So as you can see, this is an older version, but it made it easier to format. As you can see, it just takes a very complicated process and breaks it down into simple steps in a fairly visually appealing way. And that we found is really, really helpful, particularly for advocates in helping them understand what they can do, what their role is, and where they fit within the overall process.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Brett. And thank you to all our speakers, Tanisha, David, and Brett. So we're right on time, which is great. Sia and myself would like to offer up, this format, this kind of procedure. If this is something you're interested to implement at your organization or with your department, you are welcome to use it. And as you've heard today, 3 of our MCLD members have, embraced it already and used it today and spoken to us using this framework today. So we'd welcome the interest from anybody else. And if you have any further questions about ways this process can be rolled out or the format or our experience with it, Sia and I would welcome them and follow up. So at this point, I wanted to open up to a bit of question and answer. And we'll give fair time to those calling in as to those in the room. I think we'll start with those in the room, and John, as long as it's good to keep time with any other agenda you have.
Yeah, as long as we've got like 5 minutes at the end for looking at the next steps in the movement, then we'll be fine. So
fantastic. Well, let's start with those in the room here. We're about 10 convened here, so any questions for our panelists?
I have a question.
Please.
First off, great presentations and your introductory ones as well. Thank you so much. This is Ann Hendricks-Jenkins from the movement, and my question is, when you're working internationally, as multiple presentations alluded to, it really goes against anything that anyone's ever learned, is to bring up their failures to their Western counterparts who have, coming from cultures that are very hierarchical and also, like, it's just human nature. So how do you overcome that in NURU, for example, or in some of these other organizations, so that people can really feel safe and okay and honest about talking about failure?
Well, that's a great question. I'll probably direct Manisha. I know you're on the phone. I think this would be interested to hear what your response is to this question, and maybe Sia as well, if you want to share a bit.
Manisha, I can take a stab at it. I think, so like Masum, we work in Pune, India, and we do work with stakeholders. So we work with local government and state government officials, as well as civil society partners and CSR partners. And bringing those different stakeholders together is often about showing the successes to each other and not so much showing the failures. I think the way that we do it at the 3D program is really to admit to our own failures and our own lack of knowledge and sort of model that in a way, and also reiterate that what we're trying to do is create different ways of working together, which means nobody actually knows how to do it yet, so that we're sort of co-creating throughout the process. Manisha, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, it was more a generic answer. I think we have to be cognizant of the geopolitics of funding and the geopolitics of power. And so many times, I fully agree that Asian societies are more hierarchical. And so therefore you say things that please the people above you, and you use an opportunity to put down those quotes before you. But I also feel that Western and those organizations from the global north have to realize that it's they who call the meetings, it's they who bring in the funding. And very often, if one person from the organization comes out and speaks about a failure to somebody who brings in the funding or who organizes meetings or has international conferences, that person or that organization might actually run into trouble. Whereas another organization that doesn't talk about failures might continue to be their partner. So let's be cognizant of the geopolitics of being where you're located. So if I'm located in a national capital, if I'm located in the global north, if I'm located with funding, then it's very difficult for people to come out and speak of failures unless those who are privileged also speak of their failures in the same open way.
Thanks,
That's a great point. Yeah.
Thanks, Sia. And you also, from the NURU experience, a couple of ways we've approached this as a constant challenge. 2 ways. One is embracing innovation as a value of the organization and really try to early, often, and always promote this as a value. Then we can hopefully encourage and keep a dialogue going. The other avenue that we've really embraced as an organization is teaching leadership and endorsing a leadership philosophy of servant leadership, so leading from the front, and part of that is admitting your mistakes and owning them. And so any leader, manager who joins our organization, whether at a local office or at our international office, goes through a basic training during their onboarding that endorses this leadership philosophy of owning and admitting your failures, and that's part of kind of setting the culture and setting the tone.
I want to, I've thrown up a slide because I just couldn't resist. Anne introduced this to us because all three of the exercises were really the same. You know, they were really about sort of breakdowns in human relatedness and connections and power dynamics. And she introduced this to us, and this is from a paper. If you just say water up systems change, you can download it. It's by some famous people, including Peter Senge, right? But the interesting thing is everything that almost everybody focuses on are policies, practices, resource flows, and yet whether or not those things actually work depends on these underlying relationships and connections among people and power dynamics. And so an awful lot of the first two examples were really about not being sufficiently planning for, conscious about, sensitive to power dynamics. And underlying that is people's mindset, their mental models of their roles, the cultural roles, the assumptions, explicit or not, that were in your framework. So I've just found this as an extremely useful framework, since you love frameworks, because it, I was really intrigued by how illustrative that analytic process is of kind of this way of thinking about social change in the world. Other questions? Comments? Anyone on the phone? You can unmute and throw out your question, comment, or request. And the slides are still here if we want to go back to any of them. Anyone?
This is Janet.
Yes.
I just want to
Hi,
say this
Janet.
was a really great way
May I ask
to
a question?
frame the presentation. I just want to give kudos to everyone who presented and the organizers.
Great, thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Janet.
Thank you.
And somebody else had popped in. Who was that?
Yes, Tashoma.
Hi, Tashome.
Hi. May I ask the last presenter about the policy implementation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead.
In your learning assumption, it seems that your assumption is that the policy will be implemented if you do supply-side advocacy. That is empowering the service providers, the government and the NGOs. But the most important issue are the demand-side advocacy. That is the right holders who demand, who have the right to get the services and things that, and what was the learning. For policy implementation, that is most important because people have to ask, people have to push the government and those who are working with them. This is my question.
I think I caught some of that, and if I don't respond correctly, please let me know. So you're wondering, like, what's the most important?
Well, no, he's affirming that you had spoken about supply-side advocacy, that is civil society pushing the service providers or the implementers of the policy, and he's saying that his experience is that demand-side advocacy, what you refer to as kind of education about the law, but getting the peoples whose rights are being violated to be aware of it and demanding action. So he was distinguishing those two forms of implementation advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there are countless examples of laws that failed because there wasn't public buy-in, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's not just, that's obviously a core part of any advocacy campaign to pass the policy. But it's easy to forget that you need to maintain that public support moving forward through the process, so that ultimately, depending on the type of law, I mean, if it's a type of law like tobacco control that we work on, you're looking for social norm change, and that comes from high compliance. And so it's important to not just make sure that you have communication strategies that build public support while you're going through the advocacy campaign to pass the policy, but you need to maintain that public support. And sometimes that's a shift in messaging during the implementation phase, but it's absolutely critical to success.
Good point. Thanks, Ashome. Other questions, comments on the phone?
Just a simple logistical question. You mentioned
Louder.
Sorry, this is Mary Kate at the Hunger Project. Just a simple logistical question. I think, Brett, yours might be a little bit, not harder to answer, but yours was over a long process as far as time is concerned. But when you mentioned that you're looking at failures at your annual business meeting, and then in your particular case that you described, you said first that you need space, time, and resources. How much time are people needing to actually go through these failures and assess to do not just the learning, but the adaptation, both Matt, I mean, I guess you can answer this too, but I think yours was throughout everything from day one. But if you're talking about an organization sitting down at the executive level, making a plan for, we need to have a particular learning and adaptation strategy, what types of time, resources, and space are we talking about?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mary Kate. Look, learning needs to be suited to the circumstances, and in our experience at Nuru, we wanted the template to be simple. And so having to read a very long report, that could be the right answer for the lesson that you want to document, you want to learn. But we wanted to make the learning really accessible to others in the organization. So we'll literally write these case studies. Each one is a page, and that's actually very strictly held to, so about 250 words max. And for each particular case study, it should be narrowly focused on a particular instance. And then we can write many of them. If there's different topic areas or things people are passionate about, that takes about 2 weeks to write. We do a bit of peer editing internally. And then the expectation is that all the staff members who attend our annual business meeting read them, and we give them about 1 work week in their side hours to do that, and then hold a panel to discuss and then take action. But some of the lessons that we document, it might be a very discrete failure and lesson learned that we can document quickly and we can learn quickly and implement, take action on. Others really do take years. And then in terms of the documentation, we actually have an annual cycle, and then all of that documentation can then feed up into a compendium, and that can be published, let's say, in a 5-year period. So the last time we published all of these lessons learned together in a compendium was 2014. So we're coming up on another cycle where then we take the last 5 years of documentation, we could pull that together, curate it, and now put that together into one in a bigger report.
That's great.
I have a question about, David, about developmental evaluation. Being another self-taught M&E nerd, I've heard of it, but this is the first actual discussion I've participated in about it. And you commented about having this DE, like a person full-time, embedded into an overall project.
Sure.
So was the DE person in this Cambodia example a search person or from another organization, or where did the DE person come from?
Sure. So just to take a quick step back.
Yeah.
So the methodology encourages that the embedded person, the evaluator, be third party, external.
Right.
So in this case, search through a developmental evaluation mechanism was hired to conduct this evaluation, and we then hired the consultant who performed. So technically a search person, yeah,
Okay.
but it was an external consultant.
Great. And how common is this?
DE,
Yeah.
becoming more common, I have to say. And so I work on a USAID activity that pilots this throughout different parts of the agency, and it's sort of gaining speed. So there's been more and more presentations at the American Evaluation Association conference every year, for example.
And could we embed a DE person inside USAID for their decision-making processes?
I'd love to.
Do they have to be there from the beginning?
That's a great question. So in the case that I talked about, no, that was not the case. So the evaluator arrived about a year after implementation began on the project, and we've sort of seen a variety of cases, and it I hate to always say like it depends on the context, but it depends on the context. I would say, generally speaking, it is better to have the evaluator start at project or activity startup, just so they can get acclimated with the team and everyone sort of learns at the same time what's happening. In other cases where startup is difficult, or there's a lot of challenges around organizational development to get the program started, it's like setting up offices and things like that, then it's better to wait a bit until the actual meat of the implementation begins to bring a DE person in.
Can I add to that? Because I'm so interested in that too. In fact, I think I learned about it from the person who had that job, but there's developmental, like the use of the term developmental, meaning like emergent or adaptive, right, is so confusing in the world of international development where everyone uses the word development for everything. But I have started to be able to hear when people are using it that way, and there's also this group out of UK that is now doing training of developmental leadership. Have you seen that?
I haven't.
Yeah, and they mean it in that same way too. So it's in effect how to be an adaptive manager, I guess, in a way.
Yeah.
And so I think that, first off, I wish the term was like not so confusing to people, but it's okay because we can always qualify it. But also this idea, it goes so well with emerging systems practice that it's a continual adaptation, because used to be evaluation was like, did it work or didn't it, as it was supposed to. But now it's kind of like, how can we use evaluation to incrementally improve things all along the way with no judgment, there about yes or no. So I look forward to learning more about it. And the idea that the third-party group needs to be available, like search is available to field these people, is a critical element to it all, right? So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I'm actually glad you mentioned the name, because to me, it's sort of a terrible name in both the words, because yes, developmental, that's confusing in international development, but also evaluate, it's not an accountability evaluation.
Yes.
And so when you call it an evaluation, that gets people suspicious. There's a spy embedded in their midst to evaluate. So yeah, it really is a misnomer. But.
Yeah. What would you call it then if you could rename it today?
So we've actually had cases where people got so suspicious of the methodology that they had to just call it something else in programs. We've seen like adaptive management specialist, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good.
Interesting.
Adaptation prod.
That's great.
Adaptation evangelist. Okay, so thank you all. This has been a wonderful session. So if everybody could take a pause and a breath, I want to introduce an entirely new initiative within the movement. And those of us in the Secretariat, and probably you as champions of community-led development within your organizations, have probably seen that a lot of people in a lot of our members have never heard of community-led development and don't know really what it stands for. And that its kind of overall distinction from other flavors of community development is not at all clear. The terminology is not familiar. And so one of the things that we've noticed is that there's a huge need for sort of internal advocacy, socialization of the basis of community-led development, the principles of it, the the practice of it, just having a clear understanding when CARE says that they're a member of this movement, does that mean the thousands of CARE staff worldwide know that they're part of that movement or what it stands for? And most organizations do have a wonderful internal system of internal communications and alignment, but we don't so far necessarily have access to it. And my colleague, Mary Kate, has taken up the challenge of being the catalyst for this happening within the movement. So I want her to speak about it briefly, and this is by means of a strong invitation for involvement and input. This is probably a whole new working group within the movement, and the development of some tools. So I'll bring up your PDF MK, and you can talk about what you envision and what you think we should do.
So just as a kickstart to, increase engagement from our 60+ members, both that are part of the global/DC chapter as well as our national chapters, we figured a very simple engagement tool or brochure would be helpful. Our current one-pager is starting to outdate itself, so all the goals are still the same. We have a lot more going on that we need to make clear, and take this with a grain of salt because I am not a communications professional, so I've used a program to just kind of pull together what might be a simple and digestible four-pager. But I would love people's input on what's highlighted, what is missing. For example, I haven't listed in these 4 pages this need to socialize the movement or basic principles that we've outlined as part of the movement, but I just want it to be this simple. And I wanted to have an entire page dedicated for people to see the breadth of the members, because it is a $6 billion collective amount of civil society revenue, which is rather clout driving. And and then an entire page dedicated to metasynthesis as well. But I would, and without needing an extensive amount of time or probably as much intensive engagement as we see in the metasynthesis working groups, just a few people that would like to take a look, maybe especially folks who have been members since the beginning or have joined for a certain purpose, that can look at this and really help decide what types of activities that we're doing and methods and process that we're putting into action that would be helpful, that I will use when I go to speak to a CEO or a VP or another top level staffer, that will hopefully be able to incentivize, mobilize, increase awareness internally within the organization. And that's so that every time I go to a UN meeting or any of us are at, an interaction forum or anything like that, we go up, oh, we're both in the movement together, and someone's like, what the heck is that? Have it be more of a stamp on people's websites and something that can be included in new staff orientation, et cetera. So, I guess this could be used, of course, as external engagement as well. I don't see why not. It should be as simple and digestible for that, but this is really going to be more for bringing aboard increased awareness and internal engagement from our existing members, and especially so that we can see not just more awareness from currently very participatory members, but gain more engagement from members who are just kind of sitting on the sidelines and may have had staff transitions or aren't really sure what activities are happening that are most beneficial for them. And that's why I also think the metasynthesis page is most useful, because that has been a big hot plate for increasing our engagement and incentive for members. I don't know that we necessarily have the time or need to go through this now, but I would love even just some folks who are in the room or on the phone to let me know if you'd be cool to even just go through this on your own time. I don't know that we necessarily need to have weekly or monthly meetings to do this. If folks can even just look at it off in their own time and then get back to me and then do 1 or 2 ad hoc gatherings where we can do some live screen sharing editing to it, that would be really helpful. I would like it done in less than a month if that's realistic, since UNGA's coming up, and the sooner the better to mobilize this internal socialization and engagement of the movement. So I will pass it there and
Yeah,
you guys under pressure.
We'll circulate your sort of zero draft
Yeah, that'd be
to
great.
not only the people who are on this call, but we have about, the invitations to the call, my sort of personal emails go out to about 240 people a week, so we'll send it out to everyone with a note to send you
That'd be great.
ideas or who might want to participate, and because it would be, the experience, particularly with the metasynthesis, is that there are people who leadership on this issue can just explode within the context of the movement. And so we want some more of that exploding to happen, particularly on the leadership teams of these organizations as we try to develop large-scale funding consortiums and large-scale proposals. I know our CEO and some other CEOs are very cognizant of this and are going to be networking at that level to try to get support. There's the research working groups. There's now starting to emerge the humanitarian working group. So I think there's lots of opportunities for the people in our organizations to apply their creativity and leadership to our goals. So that's the game plan, and Mary Kate will be the czarina of it. And the other thing I want to mention, we have several of our colleagues on the phone around the world. Our regional coordinators were just together and really took a stand to up the pace of moving from a phase of enlisting membership and creating a shared vision into real collective action, and looking for activities that can be carried out together, either with funding or without funding, but starting to move into a real action phase in our national chapters. So that's the other big goal that we have. So unleashing more leadership within our members and focus and really moving into concentration in the chapters towards causing real change in people's lives collectively. So that's, then I just want to throw up the final slide of let's see, there is a way to jump to the very end. Okay, coming events. So as Mary Kate said, the UN General Assembly and the climate summit that precedes it are coming up. This is a not as big deal in UNGA as 2020 will be, but it's going to be a big deal. UNGA, we all of us who were at High Level Political Forum were really inspired by the amount of CLD-ness that was in the room almost everywhere. Everyone was talking about citizen-generated data and citizen engagement and localizing SDGs, and it was like almost totally different than just a year ago. So something is working in the cosmos, and we are working particularly, I know Carol's online in Nairobi. I don't know if Ann was online in Nairobi, but we really think, given the pioneering work Kenya's done in devolution, that they should be hosting a side event with us. So if you have friends in Kenya, call up their foreign ministry and tell them that we're where they should play when they come to UNGA. Then the Zambia chapter of the movement will launch, and will be there on behalf of the Secretariat, Rollins and Marissa. I don't think either of them are on this call because I think they're still traveling back from the meetings they were at last week. But that is coming up. And then we did get a slot at AEA for the CLD metasynthesis. So it will be on stage at the AEA on the November 14th. And thanks to all who helped get us that slot. And yeah, Sia?
John, thanks. Just wanted to put two more events on everybody's radar. One is the ICPD plus 25, the International Conference for Population and Development. It's 25 years since Cairo.
Oh my gosh.
And mid-November, there is going to be an ICPD plus 25 summit in Nairobi. It's The other related activity is Beijing plus 25. So the Beijing Women's Conference is also 25 years since then. So that's also a key sort of global gathering point. Neither is extremely well organized or publicized. Given the current regressive global political climate, there is reluctance to sort of open up the programs of action and agreements from the original conferences.
Yes, right.
So the real energy, I think, is going to come from community-based groups and from advocacy groups. The 3D program and partners at UN Foundation are beginning to sort of mobilize. So if other members are preparing, thinking about it, November will be here before we know it. Beijing plus 25, it will happen sometime next year. And
Right.
as I get more information, I'd be happy to share it.
And is it going to be New York or is it going to be Beijing?
No, it's not going to be either.
Oh.
Right now, what I heard is it's Paris and somewhere else. But that was not
Okay.
for sure. So the idea would be to have at least 2 locations as well as sort of virtual platforms that could encourage engagement. So we'll be trying to figure out more moving forward.
Yeah, Sia, just one small typo. ICPD has become ICBD.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for
Thanks,
catching my
Linda.
typing. This is collective impact. Typos fixed really fast.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and I know we're a couple minutes over now, but I really appreciate everyone's participation. This is a really valuable session. Many thanks to Sia and Matt and Brett and David and Manisha. And you were raising your hand?
Yes, just a quick call for today. The concept note that we're pulling together to send to a couple of our partners in the Kenya chapter and hopefully the Kenyan government will be done today. So if you already have people scheduled to be coming to the General Assembly, whether they're in government, staff, program people, let me know and I'll add them to a speaker list and an event list that we'll have sent for consideration. So let me know today so we can feature you hopefully in an internal headquarters event at UNGA.
Yay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much. And that's it for the call.
Thank
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Yeah, good.